context here in Auckland. So I'll just start off with my pepeha. So tēnā koutou katoa, ko kapuarangi te maunga, ko wainui te awa, ko tainui te waka, ko Aotearoa, ko Ngāti Parau, ngā iwi, ko te whānau a tōrere nui a rua te hapu, no Tāmaki Makaurau ahau, ko Maxwell tōku whānau, ko John Isaacson taku matua, ko Pauline Isaacson taku whaia, ko Warwick Eisen taku ingoa. So I just gave a short mihi about talking a little bit about my Māori side. So I whakapapa back to Ngāti Parau on the East Coast. Actually, Ngāti Parau on the East Coast, and then Tōrere in the Eastern Bay of Plenty, and then there's Umupuia Marae over in Maraitai with Ngātaiki Tāmaki. I grew up in West Auckland on the way towards Pepeha Beach. Beautiful place, still love it, and am currently living in Hibiscus Coast. So I grew up on the family nursery in the Waitakere Ranges. I've since gone to uni, studied a Bachelor of Engineering in Civil and Environmental Engineering, and then ended up in project management for, it used to be the DHBs, but now it's Te Whatu Ora, or our national health provider body. And I'm also, I also got very into biochar and joined the Biochar Network New Zealand. I currently have the honour of chairing that group, and I'm also I've also started up a little business called Charbro Limited, and via Charbro Limited, I've also connected up with Betsy Kettle, who runs the Hibiscus Coast Zero Waste initiative under Sustainable North Trust, and also I'm part of, we're under Charbro Limited, part of the Zero Waste Network. So moving on. So just an overall structure, we'll go through sort of the objectives, have a quick overview of the both internal mandates within council. I won't labour on that too much because I'm sure you're so well aware of it. And then I'll talk quickly about the existential mandate as well. Looking at sort of climate and impact and how we can make an impact. Then I'll get into biochar and how that's related to it. Then I'll touch on and give some examples of where biochar is already being used in communities, some key takeaways and some ways to support biochar use in New Zealand, and then we can get into a Q&A. I understand that Rebecca, are you still happy to do the Q&A? I don't have access to the chat. Yep. Okay, I got a thumbs up there, so we can do that. So firstly, why bother? So we've only got one viable planet. The photo in the middle is my son, who is due in September. Very excited. And I'm doing this to leave a future worth living in for our children, both born and unborn. And this will require radical shifts in society over the next 10 years, especially. And I feel like the general populace hasn't quite fully grasped how radical those shifts are. But you know, I want to be part of that, and I'm so sort of honoured to you know, be in the company of people who are working on that. You know, working towards that circular bioeconomy, an economy that's driven by the sun directly or indirectly, and one that's deeply climate positive. So my objectives, and I hope you would share that with me, is firstly to just raise a bit of awareness about biochar and its uses, and then hopefully inspire everyone here to use biochar to help improve community well-being, or at least start thinking about it and start having conversations about that. And then maybe a next step would be considering how we can each use our own influence to empower those who are currently working on these climate positive or environmentally enhancing work. Yeah, so I'll just move on to the internal mandates. So you probably, I'm assuming you're all over this. You know this much better than I do. I just thought I'd touch on that. So waste minimization plan 2018. So net zero by 2040, taking care of people of the environment and turning waste into resources. All awesome things to do. And Te Taruke Tawhiri, Auckland's Climate Plan 2020. So to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 and achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And then waste strategy, reduce waste, reduce harm from waste. That's my simple, very simple summary of that. And then there's the national emissions reduction plan, and then waste strategy and regulations. I'll just quickly touch on the emissions trading scheme, although I don't imagine council is massively involved in the emissions trading scheme, but I will just note that Biochar is not yet part of the emissions trading scheme. And that's partly because there's confusion about biochar as a stable form of carbon versus other forms of carbon in the soil. Now, there's evidence from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change /IPCC that biochar is stable for hundreds to thousands of years, depending on how it's made and its feedstock, or the thing that it's made, the biomass that it's made from. And then other forms of carbon in the soil have a much shorter, I'll call it shelf life. And I will also note that there are private carbon markets that are accessing and marketing biochar units at the moment, but there's nobody selling biochar units in New Zealand yet. But yeah, we're working that out and having lots of conversations with MPI about that at the moment. And when I say we in that space, that's the Biochar Network New Zealand. And then there's the existential mandate. So this is the one that I care most about. Like, obviously, all of the other ones are, or all of the previous ones are ways for sort of the different levels of government to express the mandate that the people are giving. And this page here sort of represents some of the impacts or reasons why we don't want to do nothing. So, I mean, in summary, with climate change, it's mostly warming, and that impact on the hydrological cycle that makes the most impact. And we've seen that we're seeing that with Kiribati, they're likely to be our first Pacific neighbours to have the islands disappear. And then we see the example in the middle of the Hawke's Bay and Northland, where they had their droughts in 2020, and it was really difficult to maintain feed for their livestock and continue growing crops. And then you see on the right, everyone remembers when this whole sky turned orange with the Australian wildfires in 2020, and we're seeing some crazy stuff coming out of Europe at the moment, even in traditionally wet areas, like in parts of the UK. I also think of our brothers and sisters across the ditch over in Australia with their flooding, and also the Canterbury flooding that has happened every year and is still an issue. Just touching on pest migration with the change in temperature, where some pests can move very quickly, but I think possibly the most impactful, or the largest impact for climate on us and our own sort of ecosystem and future viability is that the climate patterns are moving, but the ecosystems can't. So our little tuatara there, if the eggs are incubated at 18 degrees Celsius, all the hatchlings are female. If it's at 21 degrees Celsius, it's 50-50 male and female. And at 22 degrees Celsius, it's 80% male and 20% female. So with human intervention, tuatara can survive, and they can be relocated to cooler areas, but that's not the case with a lot of the biodiversity across our nation, let alone the greater region and planet. So yeah, so this is what I guess I really care about.
And I want something from Mount Atkinson, because that will be fast.
Sorry, was that a question?
Oh, kia ora, Chantal. Oh yeah, you've got on mute now. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I didn't quite hear that one. So this slide comes out of a presentation from Auckland Climate Festival, and it talks to what does addressing carbon in the atmosphere look like. Now, there's other greenhouse gases, but carbon is the most has the greatest volume and overall is the most impactful at this point in time. So if we just start on the left, we have a spectrum of very, very slow carbon sinks towards very much faster carbon sinks. And when I say slow versus fast, it talks about how long that carbon is going to be locked up in whatever material it is part of. So you've got carbonate rocks on the left, and their lifetime is, you know, many tens of thousands of years plus, if we don't mine them and turn them into cement. And then there's proceeding right, there's the ancient buried carbon, also known as fossil fuels. And then there's the ancient forests, ocean ecosystems, and biochar. And then we get into the faster ones, which where they go into the soil, are broken down, and then get respired via bacteria and fungi back to the atmosphere, and the carbon goes back up to the atmosphere. So that happens in a matter of weeks to decades. And then there's the fastest ones, which are the microbes and the insects, which are a store of carbon for anything from hours to years. And when we have the amount of carbon being put up into the atmosphere from that respiration, from each of the natural processes, what we have is an overall sort of carbon emission through natural processes, and then a carbon sequestration via photosynthesis, and some natural weathering of rocks, drawing down the carbon from the atmosphere. So this sort of paints a balanced scenario. What we have at the moment is, in all of these carbon sinks, they are being used up, and that carbon is being emitted to atmosphere. So if we were to address that, what would that look like? That would look like, as you saw, this orange arrow got smaller, so that means that we're reducing emissions. It means that we are increasing our ability to draw down carbon from the atmosphere, and that, so a plus and a minus, a big minus gives a minus. Pretty simple conceptually. So I'll move on to biochar and where that fits in now. So what is biochar? How does it work? So if you think of each time you strike a match, you can see all the different parts of getting towards combustion. So you have the piece of wood, you have the gases coming off because it's heated, and then you have pyrolysis, which is the heating of biomass in a local area without oxygen. And then you can see that blackened charcoal forming, and then you can see the combustion of the volatile substances coming off the match, and that's what you see as the flame. So for making biochar production, it's essentially doing that, but at a much larger scale. So you take biomass, ideally dry and uncontaminated, and it has to be organic matter. So that's one of the technicalities. You know, is it biocarbon versus biochar? So biochar is comes from recent biomass, so recently alive biomass, and it is turned into biochar, and that is distinct from other forms of carbon, which may or may not come from fossil fuels, instead of biomass. So, if we're thinking plastics and that sort of thing, I'd call that sort of biocoal or biocarbon. And there's we recently did a bit of work with the Bioenergy Association of New Zealand, BANZ, to make that differentiation a bit clearer. So pyrolysis needs heat for startup, a bit like a match, but once you have started it up, the volatiles start coming off, and if you decide to light those volatiles or light that gas on fire, that obviously produces its own heat to then drive the system. A key requirement
we need some
for
lunch.
biochar.
Have lunch first, and then you can play your thing.
A key requirement for biochar to not turn into ash is that low or no oxygen environment. So what comes out of that? You get the biochar, and one ton of biochar equals about 2.5 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And that extra conversion is because each carbon that you lock into that biochar, long-lived biochar structure, also comes with 2 oxygen atoms. And there's a bit of math, but it works out to about 2.5. If you get pure carbon, it works out to 3.67 tons of biochar per ton of pure carbon. What you also get is 50% of the roughly 50% of the carbon in that biomass is turned into those volatiles, which gas off, and you can harness that energy for beneficial use, or you can use that for forming long-lived carbon bonds within the biochar. So you can feed that back in and keep that process going, and only harvest the rest or the leftovers of that process. And you also get bio oils. There's one pyroligneous acid, and the other one is sort of a heavier tarry bio oil. Pyroligneous acid has lots of uses. I won't go into that now. The tarry one, they're still looking at how they can upgrade it and distill that. But yeah, overall, you can see the difference between photosynthesis and respiration in a tree. When that tree dies, that carbon goes returns to the atmosphere and is released. Some of that may stay in the soil, but with biochar, what you can do is at the end of life of that tree, or if you say have a source of carbon-rich substance, you can use pyrolysis as a tool to change the chemical structure into something that looks a lot more like graphite than it does the original material, or at a nanoscale. And what that does is that gives a net sequestration, and that converts that fast carbon into slow carbon. Okay, so that was very quick. So we'll get to something that's possibly, a bit closer to home and more accessible. So biochar in Aotearoa, starting from the oldest uses. So biochar has been used by Māori to improve soil in many areas, especially where kumara has been grown. And that's all the way from the top of the North Island down to coastal Canterbury, so the Banks Peninsula, etc. And paraumu, or sort of the dark Māori soils, have been found all the way down to the Tasman area. And we see with the map and the inset here, there's some really valuable and highly productive dark soils that have been produced down in the Richmond, Tasman area. And also you can see the difference in the soil profile in this picture here on the right, where that soil has been amended, and that's near the Abel Tasman track. A bit of state of play in the modern arena. So there's a few small and medium enterprise biochar producers, and each of them are doing sort of in the single to tens of tons. So that's sort of people looking to break into the bigger markets. And then there's also Red Stag Sawmill, which is almost a happy accident. So Red Stag Sawmill has tons and tons of sawdust, and it uses that via an inefficient boiler and I say inefficient because it doesn't completely burn all of the carbon off of the biomass feedstock. And what comes out is something we call high carbon boiler ash, which is I'd call it a lower grade biochar. And it's lower grade because it doesn't have as much as much carbon per volume or per ton as other carbon products and other biochar products. So you might be getting sort of maybe 30 to 60%. It's not my product, so you need to talk with the people who market that. Whereas if you're making biochar, some of the people who make biochar, like myself, and the people that I train to make biochar, they're getting sort of 70+% carbon content. So they can be pretty confident that they're going to have that 2.5 tons of CO2 sequestered per ton of biochar that they make. The Red Stag sawmill's doing about 3,000 tons plus per annum. What's awesome about that is they're currently mining a landfill. So that high carbon boiler ash wasn't seen as useful earlier, and they just made a massive landfill in the area, and now that landfill is being mined and it's being used to improve soil across the country, and I'll talk to that on the next slide. Some key challenges for biochar across the country at the moment. So biomass supply, given that there's about 3.5 million tons of biomass that is residues or leftovers from urban processes or all sorts of excess biomass. If we processed all of that and turned that into biochar, you'd get about 420,000 tons per annum. And together that would sequester 1% and mitigate a further 6% of New Zealand's greenhouse gases per annum. And that direct sequestration is locking that carbon up in the biochar. And the extra 6% is displacing things that are, shall I say, less efficient or less climate positive. And I can talk on that a bit later, but I won't go into detail just yet. And other key challenges are consenting. So as a percentage of the operation, if you're looking to set up a large biochar operation, consenting will be a large investment, and that will need to be recouped from across a large volume during the operational period which you're producing the biochar in. Finance is interestingly an issue. So production is relatively open source, so is therefore accessible. And because of that accessibility, it is less appealing to capitalists who seek IP protection. So what really helps biochar producers in that kind of space is either getting some kind of grant funding or some forward commitment from people who are keen to buy it and see the value of it and have spent the time to invest in looking at how it can empower their own operations. And then, of course, with any other innovation, there is that diffusion of innovation. So production is fairly mature, and the uses are there. There's about 55 uses of biochar and still counting. However, in New Zealand, we've got, I just call them market development challenges. So if you just go down the road and you say, hey, have you heard of biochar? People will say, what? And that's, that non-recognition and also sort of some unhelpful, uninformed opinions coming through can sort of get in the way of what can be really, really useful for us regionally and nationally. So good stories. So this slide talks to a few of the biochar uses. So I'll start on the top left. Auckland Council has supported, I think through the WMIF funding, the Hibiscus Coast Zero Waste City to Farm project. So they're turning, they are closing the nutrient cycle and they're turning almost useless Rodney clay into a fertile banana plantation and orchard with bokashi food scrap composting and biochar and some mulch on top. And what I just heard this the other day from Betsy. She mentioned that she had one of the top banana growers across the country who used to grow it commercially over in South Africa come over and comment, "Oh, your bananas are healthier than mine," which is amazing. And you know, I'd love to see a whole lot more of that happening. And yeah, so there's a fair bit of work engaging with the community in enabling that, and I'd love to see that increase a bit more. I mentioned pukekohe. So there's a few growers, and when I say a few, it's not just a handful, and they're farming hundreds of hectares of onions and potatoes, and they are using 30 to 50% fertilizer, including synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, on their fields in Pukekohe. And not just that, they are seeing better water retention, and they are no longer having to, at the end of the season, because the waters push the soil downhill, because they've got decent soil structure now, they don't have to grab their soil from the bottom of the hill and push it all the way up to the top for the next season. I mean, the fact that that makes economic sense, or made economic sense previously, just sort of blew my mind when I heard that. But yeah, I will touch on the manure too, just because it's an example of you know, biomass can be turned into biochar and biogas, and the plant that's being proposed in the manure too is capable of doing that. However, I would hesitate to call the material that comes out of that biochar, because it's mixed with other things that you wouldn't want to apply to soil. However, you know, they've got their own methods of mitigating and mitigating those risks, and I won't go too into that. It's a bit of a hot topic. And then on the top right, there's in the Waiuku and far north, there's increase in feed conversion rates for cattle. NZ Steel has done a trial on using biochar as a non-fossil carbon reductant to help make steel. You can use it as a structural binder to help improve water infiltration and reduce stormwater treatment area footprints, especially where you're looking to filter out heavy metals like zinc. You can also use it in cosmetics and medicine. You can upgrade it to activated carbon. Carbonscape on the bottom left is doing some awesome stuff, upgrading biochar into graphite for batteries, for EVs and the like. So it's graphite that's sourced from trees instead of mines, which is awesome. You can use it in food. People have done some funny things with it. I haven't tried it yet, but I'd love to when it's a bit safer to go into restaurants. And then you can. There have been trials by Auckland University on using biochar to help improve asphalt binding, and that can reduce that carbon footprint there as well. So yeah, you can see here that it's there's opportunities, and you can see some of the things that would have otherwise been less climate positive and now more climate positive because biochar has been involved there. Shout out to Stockholm. So Stockholm, this is definitely, you know, if you want to look at one project and look at how it increases community well-being, look up the Stockholm Biochar project. So they are, you know, it's a large city. They do 500,000 tons of material. They put it through their biochar making plant. They make pyrolysis oil. They make biochar. They use their biochar to help their trees grow better when they're doing plantings across their roads. They use it on farmland around the cities, and then they biorefine that pyrolysis oil and use that for biofuels. And then the excess heat, which we talked about before, they've used that to heat different areas, both industrial areas as well as residential areas, as part of their district heating system, which is so cool. So yeah, and just on the top left, they've their biomass diversion from landfill overall has a negative 70 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour energy carbon footprint, which is much better than what we're getting from from your average kilowatt hour purchase in winter here in New Zealand. So some key takeaways. Biochar is a tool that can upcycle organic resources, and you have to invest in the expertise to ensure that you get that multiple community benefit. Because if it's done poorly, it can be climate negative because you're producing lots and lots of incomplete combustion instead of running it clean. And also, if you don't use it so well, you're not necessarily going to get the benefits like has been mentioned before. So there's different parameters that need to be controlled to get the correct production parameters and post-processing parameters so that it can be used and people can get their best benefit out of it. So those opportunities, I guess in summary, those opportunities for community value and increasing that per unit of biomass. So biochar, it's essentially reverse coal. It helps reduce and displace climate negative practices and products. We talked about some of the environmental and health benefits. With the Healthy Waters reform and us looking to enhance the mode of our why being water, there's definitely opportunities in that space. And what's cool about biochar is it's an OPEX cost, but it works like CAPEX in that you apply it, you pay for it as an expense, but it comes out as a CAPEX improvement because it stays there and you get that benefit. If, say, for example, if you're using it in soil, you get that benefit over and over and over each time you plant your crops. And biochar can be enabled and more viable by greater understanding of the benefits and understanding where those benefits are greater than the cost and the risk of setting it up. And those benefits can be valued in kind or cash. And then also we talked earlier about those forward commitments which enable finance. So how you can help. So just being here, thank you for coming along and listening to me getting all enthusiastic about biochar. So stay curious, not just about biochar, but if you go to drawdown.org/solutions, it talks about the 100 best options for reversing climate change. I just like biochar because it's hard to undo biochar once it's made. Like you have to mine it up, put it all together and set it on fire at really high temperature, which is rather hard. And also connects with credible climate proponents. And I say credible because there's a lot of fluff going around at the moment in the climate space. You can ask your designers and suppliers how biochar can add value. And then like I've already spoken with people who are interested in using biochar for stormwater applications in New Zealand. And many others. There is, so for example, another example there, I didn't include it in the previous slides for space, but there's been some research out of the University of Auckland where biochar has been used in anaerobic digestion to increase the, essentially act like a catalyst to increase the speed of anaerobic digestion by at least 30%, which I thought was fantastic. And if you are land constrained, then that is a very useful thing to do. You can support local innovation and trials, so helping producers secure areas for RMA compliant production. So at the moment, and if you want to do it in urban areas, you need to have heavy industrial zoning and all of the things that go with that and get permits. Otherwise, you can do it out in rural areas, away from neighbours, under, sorry, don't quote me on the zoning, but there's under some rural zones. You can support WMF submissions. And also council has a role. I understand that it's currently sort of working as the organic resource market maker, or at least sort of, through the organic resource permit system. There's a big role that council is taking at the moment. At a personal level, you can support locally made biochar and leave good reviews. Show that you support it and build that mandate across. Speak well of us, engage with your elected representatives, vote for viable ecosystems, and plant trees. So thank you, everyone. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them now. And if you have, if you want to find out more, there's a few places that you can go and visit and ask some questions. And yeah, so yeah, thank you for listening.
Kia ora, Warwick, thank you. That was an amazing overview. I wonder if do you want to go back to the other slide that just has your details
Sure.
on it, perhaps? And I'll copy your email into the chat because I imagine there's going to be potentially some people really interested in following up with you and working out, how biochar could play a role in the context of our projects, and also with things as council we haven't even thought of yet, like what are the opportunities that we can be foreseeing in the future to implement some of these things within what we're already doing. So yeah, thank you, Warwick. That was awesome, and a lot for us to learn as well. A lot of technical stuff for us to absorb. Some of us understand that more than others, and also, but seeing those examples of it in action is fantastic. And just also want to shout out to Betsy Kettle. I'm not sure if she's online today, but Hibiscus Coast Zero Waste definitely really involved with biochar, and they sometimes run workshops on how to make it. So go along to one of those if you can. I put the link to City to Farm initiative in the chat as well, so have a read up on that. So yeah, we're already doing some great things with some incredible community entities working hard on this, which is great. So I just want to open up for a few questions. I can see Rebecca has asked, if biochar doesn't break down, how does it help plants?
I could talk for an hour and a half on that, but
quick version.
The quick version is there's something called cation and anion exchange capacity, which is a measure of fertility. So biochar can help plants by increasing the ability of the soil to hold on to nutrients so that they don't leach away. It can increase the soil water plant available water holding capacity. It can work as an electron shuttle for microbes to help with some of the detailed chemistry that happens in the soil between the plants and the microbes and the nutrients in the soil. It can help open up the soil by permanently changing the structure. I think those are the main ones. Yeah, and it lasts for a long time.
Cool, thank you. Susie has shared a comment that says, I see potential for diverting weeds from landfill, but I can see it can be rather hard to do at small scale and for home gardeners.
Yes. I guess some of the energy balance there, that's something to be taken account of, because biochar, like the lower the water content of whatever's being used or turned into biochar, the less energy that needs to be invested in evaporating that water off. So yes, like woody biomass is awesome. That's the premium product. Everyone should use it. Every time we cut down a tree in any park across Auckland, if it doesn't have an immediate use to be turned into biochar, which I understand, having talked with some arborists, that there's quite a few locations where there isn't an immediate use for those wood chips. there's an opportunity for Auckland Council to use its own biomass. And yes, weeds, the excess energy from the woody biomass can be invested in converting some of the ideally dried weeds into something that is very long-lived in biochar form. So yeah, it definitely something to look at.
Cool, thanks, Warwick. Fiona's asked, can you further explain the mining of landfills you touched on?
Yes. So I don't know exactly where the landfill is, but I understand that the Red Stag sawmill has a landfill where it was landfilling the high carbon boiler ash. And now, because it's seen as something that's useful and worth digging out, that landfill is being mined to the tune of about 1,000 tons per year, in addition to the existing 3,000 tons per year that the current boiler makes. So yeah, 1,000 tons a year of that is being, well, an extra 1,000 tons a year, making 4,000-ish tons a year, which is, I think it's blimmin' awesome.
Oh, thank you. Brianna has asked, can treated timber be used to produce biochar? Do the chemicals remain in the biochar or do they burn off?
So technically, yes. However, you'd have to. So before you put it in, you have to have a machine that won't break down. If we're talking H1.2, the pink stuff with boron in it, at high heat that turns into boric acid, which eats away at machines. So you'd need something like they have up in Northland at the cement works, that can handle the kinds of feedstock that's going into it. And then also you'd need to be very careful about what you do with the ash, and also what you do with the fly ash or the what's filtered out of the top before the gases go to atmosphere. But yes, you can still do it, but you've got to be very careful about it. And it's obviously, with all of those controls, it's more expensive. But that's what Green Gorilla currently does. They just don't make biochar; they completely burn it to ash. But there's an opportunity there for them to change their operation, or their partner's operation up north.
Oh, Rebecca has asked, has biochar production in New Zealand have a set of standards to ensure that the production is completed properly?
So the quick answer to that is no. The longer answer to that is that the Biochar Network New Zealand advocates a series of good practices, and we advocate for the International Biochar Initiative's good practices. However, there's also a different group called ANSBIG, which also have a code of practice. The difference between both of those sort of guidelines and code of practice is with a standard, versus a standard is with a standard, you have to write the standard, and then you have to consult essentially every man and his dog to get their acceptance before it can get written in as sort of the standard that everyone has to follow. And in some ways that makes it easier, but in some ways, bad actors can advocate poor practices. So we just have to be careful of that, and we in the Biochar Network stay as close as we can to people who are looking to make biochar in New Zealand, and connect them and make recommendations to them for what good practice looks like, and encourage them not to call it biochar if it's actually not, which is what I recently did a few months ago with someone who's developing a project.
Thanks, Warwick. Corey, oh, by the way, Corey and Marama, who are on the line, gave you a special shout out. I'll make sure that you read their comments later. So Corey asks, is biochar proven to increase yield in crops, or does it increase carbon in the soil?
So I'll start with the carbon in the soil. So there's two concepts called negative and positive priming. And depending on what's already in your soil and the biology in your soil, biochar itself, that's not going away. But what it can do is it can kickstart the digestive ecosystem within the soil. And in some cases, especially if it's tilled in, that can I actually feel like it's more to do with the tilling than the biochar itself. But I'll just try stay balanced here. In that case, what can happen is you get something called positive priming, which is basically digesting faster, and some of the shorter term carbon being digested faster and going to atmosphere. But in other cases, which gut feel based on the literature that I've read about 70% of the time, biochar does something called negative priming, or slowing down the digestive system and reducing the release of carbon. And something that's also quite cool in that space is if you were to top a landfill with biochar or a manure lagoon with biochar, what you get is biochar absorbs nitrogen dioxide, and CH4 methane and CO2 carbon dioxide. And you have opportunity for biochar to be a bit of a buffer layer over the top of that, so that good microbes that can process each of those and turn them into non-greenhouse gases can get an opportunity to act there. In terms of yield, you need to be doing it properly. You can't just throw it on. So biochar, if you were to just throw it on, what it would do initially, if you haven't pre-treated it through two processes called charging and inoculation, if you were to just throw it on, what it would do is it would compete with your plants or the soil microbiology, a bit like a magnet. A magnet, if you imagine it with iron filings around it, it would compete with your soil biology until the surface of it is full. And then after that, it ends, after that, it sort of becomes that supermarket for the soil biology and the plants. So what you can do there is you need to be careful about ensuring that that supermarket is full before you put it in the soil. And then also you need to staff that supermarket with soil biology for best results, which means putting in good beneficial bacteria, fungi, doing a really high quality compost, and some of the more exotic microbes, which I won't go into detail here about. So, but overall, in trials, we've seen on average the increase has been about 15%, but there's been examples up to sort of 200, 300, 400% increase. It varies by crop, by location, each of those parameters. So yeah, you need to get someone who knows what they're talking about.
Cool, thanks, Warwick. So this is probably our last question. It's a bit of a long one. Thanks, Steve. Steve, are you on the line? Do you want to read out your question?
Yeah. Oh, excuse me.
There he is. Hello.
Yeah, hi. How's it going? Thanks, Warwick. It was super interesting. So if you had a ton of wood waste and you had 4 different options, what would have the best climate outcome? So first option, if you just applied the wood chip on the side of motorway as mulch, just to suppress weed growth. Second option, to add it to compost and then apply the finished compost onto horticultural land as a soil amendment. Third option, to put it through a plant and create some biochar and then apply that on horticultural land. And the fourth option, just to put it through the cement kiln at Golden Bay.
Right.
Is that an easy answer? Like,
Yes.
is that something you just, yeah, okay, cool.
Well, I guess, you know, with obviously we've got to make some assumptions about that, but so there's quite a few studies that have done the comparison between biochar versus bioenergy, and the answer to that question, you know, is it best is the carbon best invested as turning to energy versus turning to biochar? And the comparison really becomes most relevant depending on the carbon intensity of the fuel that you're displacing. So, for example, if you were to turn it, create bioenergy from the biomass, and that were to displace, say, for example, something that's extremely nitrogen rich, or you know, some dirty coal, then you know that sort of becomes a bit more even. However, biochar still comes out on top there because you can create the biochar and you've still got 50% energy with the volatiles, which you can use for you know, to power whatever you're wanting to power. In terms of biochar versus compost, Marlborough District Council commissioned a good study on grape mark, which is what's left over when you press grapes and, you know, branch bits in your big winery, and you're looking to make that wine. So what you can do there is what they saw there is comparing compost versus biochar. Compost, you gas off a lot of the carbon, especially if you get up to high heat, and that's why you see such a large volume reduction. But with the biochar, you would come out with a more climate positive outcome, and you'd actually get net sequestration. Once biomass is composted, I guess the only sequestration that remains is what's left inside that compost. So if you're getting that volume reduction, that's a very good sign that you've got it gassing off. And then the mulch, I don't have a direct comparison with mulch. However, just I have made a comparison, or I have looked at some life cycle analyses, and I'm happy to send you whatever you want of these. There's a lady called Kelpie Wilson out of the States who looked at mulching versus biochar. And it's mostly to do with the energy required to rip up the biomass into something that is mulch size. And that's usually done with something that's petrol or diesel powered. And in that case, mulching wouldn't come out so well. So from all the studies that I'm aware of, biochar comes out on top on that space, and then it would be possibly second equal mulch and compost, depending on the usability of the biomass and the time of year, and therefore carbon intensity of electricity, or the other fuels that you're displacing. And then bioenergy sort of might be second equal with those two, or third, depending on a number of factors. But yeah, great question.
That was a great question. Thanks, Steve. And great answers, Warwick. Just amazed how you have all this knowledge and all the research that just backs everything up. So yeah, thank you so much. I think we're just about out of time, but we just want to say a huge thank you for your time and sharing your incredible knowledge with us. And just another plug that if you want to get in touch with Warwick, just have a think about how he may be able to support some things, or even spaces of work that he could get involved with as well down the track along the way. Yeah, it'd be great to hear from you. And yeah, and all the best, Warwick, for your new baby coming along soon. We wish you all the best into that journey of parenthood. And thank you again. And we have recorded this, so if you would like to receive a copy of the recording to pass on to people who couldn't be here, then just let Natalie or myself know, and we can get that to you as well. So kia ora everybody, and thanks for joining us today. Thanks again, Warwick.
Good all. Thank you for having me
Kia ora.
along.
Thank you so
Thanks so
much,
much,
Warwick. That was
Warwick.
amazing.
Awesome. Well, yep. Keep doing what you're doing. I'm loving seeing the outcomes of all of this diversion and conversion to circular economy. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I've got some questions for you, Warwick, so I might send you an email. Cool.
Awesome. Thanks, Elise.
Okay, bye.
All right.
Thank you, Rebecca. Kia ora.
Good
No
day, everyone.
worries.
See you later.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Natalie, for being cat today.
No worries, I didn't contribute a lot, but
No, that's great. Thanks for your help.
you're welcome.